Lindsey Graham, a veteran Republican senator and longtime advocate of U.S. military intervention abroad, has said it would be worth spending money to bring down the Iranian government. Speaking during an interview on Fox News on Sunday, Graham said the fall of the Iranian leadership would transform the region.
When this regime goes down, we're going to have a new Middle East, and we're going to make a ton of money. Venezuela and Iran have 31% of the world's oil reserves. We're going to have a partnership with 31% of the known reserves. This is China's nightmare. This is a good investment.
When this regime goes down, we're going to have a new Mideast. We're going to make a ton of money. Nobody will threaten the Straits of Hormuz again. But Donald J. Trump saved the world from real chaos. Can you imagine a year from now? What would it cost America if Iran had 11 nuclear bombs to threaten us? They would hold us hostage. We would be held hostage in perpetuity by this terrorist regime. So the money we're spending is a good investment to take down a regime that's been the largest state sponsor of terrorism, has got American blood on its hands. And when this regime falls, it's not if, when, we're going to have a gateway to peace. And the next thing that will happen is Saudi Arabia will recognize Israel, and that will be the biggest change in 2,000 years in the Mideast, and Donald J. Trump is the man to make it all happen,
Lindsey Graham may have just said the quiet part out loud. They tell you wars like this are about security, about stability, about stopping threats before they spread. But then a senior U.S. senator goes on television and starts talking about oil reserves, profit, and what would become China's nightmare. That is when the mask slips. Because what Lindsey Graham recently said about Iran was not just reckless, it was revealing. Al Jazeera reported Graham saying that Iran and Venezuela together hold about 31% of the world's oil reserves, that this would be China's nightmare, and that we're going to make a ton of money. He framed the collapse of Iran's government not as a humanitarian tragedy to avoid, but as a strategic opportunity to exploit. And that matters because when powerful people tell the truth, they rarely announce it as truth. It slips out in the language of strategy, in the language of investment, in the language of opportunity, and that is exactly why this moment matters. Because Graham was not speaking about peace. He was speaking about leverage. He was not speaking about human dignity. He was speaking about assets. He was not speaking about freedom. He was speaking about what empire sounds like when it stops pretending. Now, one important point has to be made carefully. The exact reserve number should not be repeated lazily. Public reserve tables vary by source and date. A current Worldometer's reserve table lists Venezuela with about 17.17% of world oil reserves and Iran with about 11.82%, which adds up to roughly 29%, not 31%. So the precise figure may be debatable, but the deeper logic of Graham's argument was unmistakable. He was treating the oil of sovereign states as a prize to be repositioned inside a larger struggle for power. And then came the China line. This is China's nightmare. That was not random rhetoric. That was the strategic center of the remark. Because this is not only about Iran, it is about energy routes, choke points, and great power rivalry. Reuters has reported that the Strait of Hormuz typically carries about 20% of the world's oil and gas traffic, and another Reuters report says roughly 45% of China's oil imports move through Hormuz. That means any war involving Iran is never just a regional story. It is also a story about how pressure on Iran can become pressure on China. So when Graham talks about Iran, Venezuela, oil, and China in one breath, he is showing you the map inside the strategy. Iran is not being discussed as a nation of people with rights, history, and sovereignty. It is being discussed as a strategic energy node. Venezuela is not being discussed as a people struggling under sanctions and long external pressure. It is being discussed as a reserve base. China is not being discussed as a diplomatic actor. It is being discussed as the rival to be weakened. And war is not being discussed as catastrophe. It is being discussed as investment. That is the part people need to sit with. He was speaking about the collapse of a country the way an investor speaks about an undervalued asset. That is not a slip of the tongue. That is an imperial worldview. And this is exactly why Liberation Lens exists, because most coverage will stop at outrage. Most coverage will ask whether the comments were offensive, inappropriate, or too blunt. But that is not the deepest question. The deeper question is what system of power makes a remark like this thinkable in the first place? What kind of political culture produces a senator who can discuss regime collapse, oil access, and great power advantage in the language of return on investment? What kind of foreign policy mindset speaks about a nation's destruction as a business opportunity? What kind of empire talks this way and still expects to be called the defender of freedom? That is the real issue, because this was never just about one man. It is about the long history of resource politics dressed up as security policy. It is about the old habit of describing intervention as moral necessity, while privately understanding it as strategic gain. It is about the repeated conversion of human suffering into geopolitical arithmetic. It is about the way powerful states narrate war for the public in the language of safety, then discuss it among themselves in the language of control. And look at the wider context. Reuters reports that the current war has already disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, pushed oil and diesel markets into turmoil, and triggered extraordinary emergency measures, including U.S. maritime reinsurance support and sharp warnings about the consequences of prolonged closure. Reuters also reports that Japan is releasing part of its strategic oil reserves because of the conflict, and that Aramco warned of catastrophic consequences if Hormuz remains blocked. This is not a fringe issue. This is the live infrastructure of the global economy. So when Graham talks about making money from Iran's collapse, he is not speaking into a vacuum. He is speaking into a war that is already disrupting fuel supply, shipping, insurance, inflation, and the economic lives of ordinary people far beyond the battlefield. Reuters reports surging diesel prices and supply disruption tied to the conflict, with knock-on effects for transport, manufacturing, and broader growth. That means the people who pay first are not the strategists on television. It is workers, families, consumers, civilians, people who had no say in any of it. And that is the moral obscenity at the center of all this. When empire speaks in the language of investment, the human cost disappears. The dead disappear. The wounded disappear. The displaced disappear. The sanctions disappear. The inflation disappears. The people living under bombardment disappear. The entire social life of a country disappears. All that remains is the portfolio view, reserves, roots, leverage, advantage, nightmare. That is what makes the comment so revealing. Not just its aggression, but its coldness. This was not the language of peace. It was the language of acquisition. This was not democracy talk. It was portfolio talk. This was not about protecting people. It was about repositioning power. And if you want the deeper geopolitical truth, it is this. The war on Iran is not only about Iran. It is also about how the United States and its allies imagine the future of power in a world where China remains heavily dependent on energy flows that pass through vulnerable choke points. Reuters reports that China has been in talks with Iran to protect the safe passage of crude oil and Qatari LNG through Hormuz, precisely because so much of China's imported energy passes that route. That means the China angle is not a conspiracy theory. It is baked into the strategic geography of the conflict. So Graham's remark matters because it collapses several layers of imperial logic into one sentence. Resource politics, regime change, great power competition, market opportunism, and the open treatment of sovereign wealth as something to be captured after political collapse. That is why this cannot be dismissed as just rhetoric. It is a confession of method. And once you hear it clearly, many other things begin to make more sense. Why interventions are packaged morally but discussed materially. Why sanctions are presented as principled but function strategically. Why some countries are endlessly described as threats while their resources are endlessly described as opportunities. Why the language of stability so often arrives where extraction is at stake. Why human rights talk becomes loud or quiet depending on who controls the oil, the shipping lane, or the alliance map. That is the pattern. And then there's one more thing people should not miss. Graham's wording was blunt, but bluntness is useful. Because usually this logic stays hidden behind cleaner language. Usually you hear about deterrence, democracy, regional balance, or international order. This time the veil lifted. This time the sentence arrived closer to its actual meaning. That is why it landed so hard. Not because it introduced a brand new logic, but because it exposed an old one too clearly to deny. So what should people understand from all this? First, the exact reserve percentage may be arguable, but the strategic frame was plain. Iran and Venezuela were being discussed as energy assets inside a larger contest with China, not as sovereign peoples. Second, the China angle is not decorative. Reuters reporting on Hormuz and Chinese import dependence shows why energy choke points matter so much in this war. Third, the real significance of the remark is not personal scandal. It is structural revelation. Graham did not merely say something offensive. He exposed the business logic that can sit underneath the language of war. And fourth, the people who pay for this logic are almost never the people speaking it. They are the civilians in the target country, the workers hit by energy shocks, the families paying more for transport, food, and fuel, the populations of the global south who keep hearing the word stability while powerful states calculate access, routes, and profit. Reuters reporting on fuel market disruption and global supply risks makes clear that the cost is already spreading far beyond Iran. So no, this was not just another outrageous television moment. It was something more dangerous than that. It was an imperial confession. Because when a senator can describe war in the language of money, reserves, and a rival's nightmare, the question is no longer whether the rhetoric was too harsh. The question is, what kind of world order has made that rhetoric sound normal to the people who wield power? And that is the real story. Lindsey Graham did not just make a comment about Iran. He exposed the oil logic of empire. And once you hear that clearly, you can never again pretend this was only about security. This was not just reckless rhetoric, it was an imperial confession. Subscribe to Liberation Lens for the system behind the headlines.